I never thought a Tuesday evening could change my life so dramatically. But then again, I never imagined how a simple meal could become the catalyst for such a profound shift in my world. My name is Sarah, and this is where my story truly begins. The kitchen was filled with the comforting aroma of rosemary-seasoned chicken and roasted vegetables. I'd spent the entire afternoon preparing this meal, meticulously following a recipe I'd found in one of the countless cooking magazines I'd subscribed to in an attempt to improve my culinary skills. The countertops were a mess of vegetable peelings, measuring cups, and the remnants of my efforts, but I didn't mind. The end result was what mattered, and I was determined to get it right. As I set the table, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. My husband, Daniel, was due home any minute, and I knew he valued routine and order above all else. Our modest suburban home in Springfield, Missouri, was always kept immaculate, a reflection of his meticulous nature. I straightened the silverware for the umpteenth time, making sure everything was perfectly aligned. The tick of the clock on the wall seemed to grow louder with each passing second, a reminder of the impending judgment I faced. When I heard the front door open, I quickly smoothed down my apron and plastered on a smile. "Hey, honey," I called out, my voice a little too high-pitched to be natural. "Dinner's ready." Daniel walked into the kitchen, his face unreadable as he loosened his tie. He was a tall man, with dark hair that was always neatly combed and piercing blue eyes that seemed to notice every little detail. "Smells interesting," he commented, and I felt my heart sink a little at his tone. We sat down to eat in silence, the only sound the clinking of silverware against plates. I watched Daniel carefully as he took his first bite, hoping against hope that this time, just this once, he'd find the meal satisfactory. But as I saw his expression twist, I knew it was not to be. What happened next was both familiar and horrifying. Daniel spat out his mouthful of food onto the plate, his face contorted in disgust. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to make me flinch. "Is this supposed to be edible?" I felt my cheeks burn with shame as I stammered, I followed the recipe exactly. "I thought you thought wrong," Daniel cut me off. "How is it that your sister can cook a perfect roast, and you can't even handle basic seasoning? It's like you're not even trying, Sarah." His words hit me like physical blows, each one chipping away at what little self-esteem I had left. I wanted to defend myself, to explain how hard I'd tried, but the words wouldn't come. They never did when Daniel was like this. "You're worthless, Sarah," he continued, his voice growing louder. "You can't do a single thing right. Honestly, I should have married your sister. At least she knows how to take care of a household properly." As Daniel's tirade continued, I found myself retreating into my own mind, a coping mechanism I'd developed over the years. I thought about my sister, Emma, who lived just across town with her perfect husband and their two adorable children. Emma, who always seemed to have it all together, whose dinner parties were the talk of our social circle. I loved her, but in moments like these, I couldn't help but resent her a little too. The sound of the trash can lid slamming shut jolted me back to reality. I watched in horror as Daniel dumped my carefully prepared meal into the garbage. "There," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "That's where this disaster belongs." As he stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the remnants of my failed dinner, I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't the first time Daniel had spoken to me like this, far from it. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the way the setting sun cast long shadows across the kitchen, or the distant sound of our neighbors' children playing outside, oblivious to the drama unfolding in our home. Whatever it was, I knew that things couldn't go on like this. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty plates and the overflowing trash can. The chicken I'd so carefully seasoned was now mixed with coffee grounds and yesterday's newspaper. It seemed like a fitting metaphor for my marriage, something that had started with such promise, now reduced to garbage. As the evening wore on, I found myself restless. The walls of our home, once a sanctuary, now felt oppressive. I needed air, space to think. Without really deciding to, I found myself grabbing my jacket and heading out the door. The cool evening breeze was a welcome relief as I stepped outside. Our neighborhood was quiet at this hour, most families settled in for the night. I walked aimlessly, my mind replaying Daniel's words over and over again. Had I always been this useless? Was I really the terrible wife he painted me to be? My feet carried me to the small park at the end of our street. It was empty now, the swings moving gently in the breeze. I sat on a bench, looking up at the stars that were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. How had I gotten here? When had I started believing that I deserved to be treated this way? As I sat there, memories came flooding back. I remembered the early days of our relationship, when Daniel had seemed so charming and attentive. He'd bring me flowers for no reason, surprise me with weekends away. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things had changed. The compliments became fewer and farther between, replaced by criticism and comparisons. The surprises stopped, unless you counted the surprise of never knowing what might set him off. I thought about my parents, who lived a few hours away in Kansas City. They had always seemed so happy together, so supportive of each other. Was this what marriage was supposed to be like? Surely not. But then again, they had always stressed the importance of working through difficulties, of honoring one's commitments. Marriage isn't easy, my mother would say. It takes work. But this felt like more than just work. This felt like slowly drowning, gasping for air in a sea of criticism and self-doubt. As the night grew colder, I found myself fiddling with my wedding ring. It was a simple gold band, nothing fancy. Daniel had said at the time that we needed to be practical, to save for our future. Now, as I twisted it around my finger, it felt less like a symbol of love and more like a shackle. That's when I made a decision. For far too long, I had silenced my own voice to accommodate Daniel's. I had shrunk myself to fit into the box he had created for me. But no more. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew something had to change. As I finally rose from the bench and began the walk home, my resolve had solidified. I would no longer allow myself to be diminished by Daniel's words. I had something he lacked, courage. And I intended to prove it, to myself, more than anyone else. The streets were empty as I made my way back, the houses dark except for the occasional flickering of a TV through a window. It was well past midnight by the time I reached our front door. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test my strength, challenge my perceptions, and ultimately lead me to rediscover the woman I used to be, the woman I could be again. As I stepped back into our house, the silence was deafening. The air felt thick with tension, and I half expected Daniel to be waiting for me, ready to unleash another tirade about my late-night wanderings. But the living room was empty, the TV off, and a single lamp cast long shadows across the room. I made my way to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The remains of our disastrous dinner were still there, the overflowing trash can, the dirty dishes in the sink. It all seemed so trivial now, after hours of soul-searching in the park. Without really thinking about it, I found myself cleaning up. It was a habit, ingrained after years of trying to keep everything perfect for Daniel. As I scrubbed the dishes, my mind wandered back to the early days of our relationship. We had met in college, at the University of Missouri. I was studying literature, dreaming of becoming a writer, while Daniel was on the fast track to a business degree. He had seemed so worldly, so sure of himself. I remember being drawn to his confidence, his ambition. We'd spend hours talking about our future, the successful careers we'd have, the beautiful home we'd share, the family we'd raise. I smiled bitterly at the memory. How naive I'd been. Somewhere along the way, my dreams had been put on hold. My writing, once a passion that consumed me, had been relegated to secret scribblings in journals hidden away in my bedside drawer. When had I let that happen? As I dried the last plate and put it away, I realized I couldn't face going to bed just yet. Instead, I made my way to the small study that we'd set up when we first moved in. It was mostly Daniel's space now, filled with his business books and files. But in one corner, on a small bookshelf, were my old college textbooks and a few treasured novels. I ran my fingers along the spines, smiling as I came across my worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. I pulled it out, remembering how I used to lose myself in the world of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Opening it, a small piece of paper fluttered to the ground. I picked it up, recognizing my own handwriting from years ago. It was a quote I jotted down: "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will." Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre. Reading those words now, I felt a lump form in my throat. When had I lost that independent will? When had I allowed myself to become ensnared? I sank into the old armchair in the corner, clutching the book to my chest. The house was still quiet, but my mind was anything but. Memories kept flooding back, each one adding a piece to the puzzle of how I'd ended up here. I thought about our wedding day, how hopeful I'd been. It had been a small ceremony in my parents' backyard in Kansas City. I remembered the proud look on my father's face as he walked me down the aisle, and how my mother had cried happy tears. Emma had been my maid of honor, radiant in her pale blue dress. Even then, I'd felt a twinge of inadequacy next to her, but I'd pushed it aside, focusing on the love I felt for Daniel. The first few years of our marriage had been good, or so I'd thought. We'd moved to Springfield for Daniel's job, leaving behind my family and friends. I'd been excited about the fresh start, the chance to build a life together. But looking back, I could see the warning signs I'd ignored. It had started small, a comment here, a criticism there. Always delivered with a smile, always followed by "I'm just trying to help you improve, honey." And I'd believed him. I'd thought he had my best interests at heart. So I'd tried harder, pushed myself to be the perfect wife he seemed to want. I'd taken cooking classes, redecorated our home countless times, always seeking his approval. I'd given up my writing, telling myself I needed to focus on supporting Daniel's career. After all, wasn't that what a good wife did? But no matter what I did, it was never enough. The criticisms became harsher, the comparisons to Emma more frequent. And somewhere along the way, I'd started to believe them. I'd internalized every cruel word, every disappointed look. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 3 a.m. I should have been exhausted, but I felt more awake than I had in years. It was as if a veil had been lifted, allowing me to see my life clearly for the first time in a long time. I thought about my parents, about the loving relationship they shared. They had their disagreements, sure, but they always treated each other with respect. My father would never dream of speaking to my mother the way Daniel spoke to me. Was that too much to ask for? To be treated with basic kindness and respect by the person who was supposed to love me most in the world? And then there was Emma. Sweet, perfect Emma. I'd always looked up to her, but somewhere along the way, that admiration had twisted into something uglier. Daniel's constant comparisons had driven a wedge between us, and I realized with a pang of guilt that I'd been avoiding her calls lately. When was the last time we'd had a real conversation? When was the last time I'd visited my niece and nephew? As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, I made a decision. I couldn't continue like this. I deserved better, not just from Daniel, but from myself. I had let fear and self-doubt rule my life for too long. It was time to reclaim the strong, independent woman I used to be. But what did that mean, exactly? Divorce seemed like such a final, drastic step. And yet, the thought of continuing this way, of spending the rest of my life walking on eggshells and doubting my every move, was unbearable. I needed help, that much was clear. But who could I turn to? My parents would be supportive, I knew, but I cringed at the thought of disappointing them. Emma would be there for me in a heartbeat, but could I overcome my own feelings of inadequacy to reach out to her? As I sat there, wrestling with these thoughts, an idea began to form. There was a women's support group that met at the community center. I'd seen flyers for it but had always made excuses not to go. Maybe it was time to take that step. And my writing, God, how I missed it. Could I find the courage to pick up a pen again? To pour my thoughts and feelings onto paper the way I used to? The sound of movement upstairs jolted me out of my reverie. Daniel would be up soon, getting ready for work. I quickly put the book back on the shelf and made my way to the kitchen. As I started the coffee maker, another part of our daily routine, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I didn't have all the answers yet. I didn't know exactly what my next steps would be. But for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had spent the night reflecting on my past, but now it was time to start planning for my future. As I heard Daniel's footsteps on the stairs, I took a deep breath. Today would be different. Today, I would start taking small steps towards reclaiming my life. It wouldn't be easy, and I knew there would be challenges ahead. But I was ready to face them. Because somewhere in the quiet of that long night, I had rediscovered something important, my own voice. And I was determined never to let it be silenced again. The kitchen door swung open, and Daniel walked in, his face a mask of indifference. "Morning," he grunted, reaching for the coffee pot. I looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened next, things would never be the same again. The day crawled by at an agonizingly slow pace. I went through the motions of my usual routine, cleaning, laundry, preparing dinner, but my mind was elsewhere. Every creak of the house, every tick of the clock seemed to echo the thoughts swirling in my head. What would I say to Daniel when he got home? How would he react to my late-night disappearance? As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across our living room, I heard the familiar sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway. My heart began to race, and I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was to come. The front door opened, and Daniel walked in, his face unreadable. "Sarah," he called out, his voice lacking its usual edge. "In here," I replied, my own voice steadier than I felt. He entered the living room, loosening his tie as he did so. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the air thick with unspoken words. Then, to my surprise, Daniel spoke first. "You weren't here when I woke up," he said, his tone more confused than accusatory. I was worried. I blinked, taken aback by the hint of concern in his voice. It had been so long since I'd heard anything but criticism from him that I wasn't quite sure how to respond. "I needed some air," I said finally, deciding on honesty. "I went for a walk." Daniel nodded slowly, then sank into his armchair with a heavy sigh. "Look, Sarah," he began, running a hand through his hair, "about last night. I know I was harsh. It's just been such a stressful week at work, you know? The Johnson account is giving me hell, and the boss is breathing down my neck." As he continued to explain, to justify his behavior, I found myself tuning out his words and instead watching his face. There was something there I hadn't seen in a long time, vulnerability. The mask of confidence and control he usually wore had slipped, revealing a man who was, perhaps, just as lost and confused as I was. "You can't take these things so personally," he was saying as I tuned back in. "You know I don't really mean it, right?" And there it was, not quite an apology, but as close to one as Daniel had ever given. In the past, this would have been enough. I would have nodded, smiled, and done everything in my power to smooth things over, to return to our version of normal. But not tonight. Tonight, something had changed. "I'm tired, Daniel," I said simply, the words coming out before I could stop them. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. "I know, honey," he said, his voice softening. "Why don't you go to bed early? I'll clean up the kitchen." I almost laughed at the irony. Here he was, trying to be kind, to make amends in his own way, and all I could think about was how tired I was, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. I was tired of walking on eggshells, tired of never feeling good enough, tired of this dance we'd been doing for far too long. "That's not what I meant," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean, then?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. How could I explain the epiphany I'd had during my long night of reflection? How could I make him understand that his half-hearted attempt at reconciliation wasn't enough anymore? "I'm tired of this, Daniel," I said finally, gesturing vaguely between us. "I'm tired of feeling like I'm never good enough, of constantly trying to meet impossible standards. I'm tired of being compared to my sister, of having my efforts dismissed and my feelings ignored." The words came out in a rush, years of pent-up frustration and hurt spilling over. Daniel sat there, his eyes wide with shock. I don't think he'd ever heard me speak like this before. "Sarah, he started, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Please, let me finish," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "I've spent years trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect homemaker. I've given up my dreams, my passions, my sense of self-worth. And for what? To be told I'm worthless? To be made to feel like a failure every single day? Daniel's face had gone pale, his earlier attempt at reconciliation forgotten. I didn't realize. He began, but trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. No, you didn't, I agreed, a wave of sadness washing over me. And that's part of the problem. You haven't seen me, really seen me, in a long time, Daniel. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air between us. I could see Daniel struggling to process what I'd said, to reconcile this version of me with the compliant, silent wife he'd grown accustomed to. What are you saying, Sarah? He asked finally, his voice hoarse. Are you leaving me? The question hit me like a physical blow. Was I? The thought had certainly crossed my mind during my night of soul-searching. But the reality of it, the finality of it, was terrifying. I don't know, I answered honestly. I don't know what I'm doing, Daniel. All I know is that something needs to change. We can't go on like this. Daniel nodded slowly, his face a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. I didn't know you felt this way, he said softly. Why didn't you say something sooner? I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. Would you have listened? Really listened? He had the grace to look ashamed at that. I suppose I haven't been very good at that, have I? We lapsed into silence again, both lost in our own thoughts. The clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds, each one feeling like an eternity. What do we do now? Daniel asked eventually, his voice small and uncertain. I shook my head. I don't know, I admitted. But I think I need some time. Some space to figure things out. Daniel's head snapped up at that, fear flashing in his eyes. You're leaving? Not permanently, I assured him, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure if it was true. I just need some time to think, to remember who I am outside of being your wife. He nodded slowly, defeat evident in the slump of his shoulders. Where will you go? I hadn't thought that far ahead, but as soon as he asked, I knew the answer. I'm going to stay with Emma for a while, I said. The idea of facing my perfect sister was daunting, but I knew she would welcome me with open arms, no questions asked. Daniel flinched at the mention of Emma's name, no doubt remembering all the times he'd compared us. When? He asked, his voice barely audible. Tomorrow, I decided on the spot. I'll pack a bag and leave in the morning. He nodded again, seemingly unable to form words. We sat there for a while longer, the silence between us filled with years of unspoken words, of hurts and disappointments, of shattered dreams and fading love. Finally, Daniel stood up. I'll sleep in the guest room tonight, he said, not meeting my eyes. Give you space to pack. As he turned to leave, I felt a sudden urge to say something, to offer some kind of comfort. But the words stuck in my throat. What could I say that wouldn't sound hollow or false? In the end, I said nothing. I watched him walk away, his shoulders hunched, looking older and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. And as I heard the guest room door close, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name: relief, sadness, fear, and underneath it all, a glimmer of hope. Tomorrow, I would leave. Tomorrow, I would take the first step towards reclaiming myself. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my bedroom for tonight, I felt as though I was standing on the edge of a precipice. But for the first time in years, the thought of jumping didn't fill me with dread. Instead, I felt a flutter of anticipation. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: I was done being silent. My voice had been silenced for too long, and it was time to let it be heard. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, my heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The house was quiet, the silence broken only by the soft ticking of the alarm clock on my nightstand. For a moment, I lay there, staring at the familiar ceiling, trying to gather my thoughts and courage for the day ahead. With a deep breath, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The floor felt cold beneath my feet, a stark reminder that this wasn't just another morning. Today was the day I would take the first step towards, what? Freedom? Self-discovery? I wasn't sure, but I knew I had to do it. I moved around the room quietly, pulling out a suitcase from the back of the closet. As I began to pack, I realized how little I actually wanted to take with me. Most of my clothes seemed to belong to a different person, the perfect housewife I had tried so hard to be. In the end, I settled on a few comfortable outfits, my old college sweatshirt, and a pair of jeans I hadn't worn in years. As I was zipping up the suitcase, my hand brushed against something hard at the bottom of my closet. Curious, I reached in and pulled out a dusty showbox. Opening it, I felt a lump form in my throat. Inside were mementos from my college days, photographs, ticket stubs, and at the bottom, a stack of notebooks filled with my writing. I picked up one of the notebooks, my fingers tracing the faded cover. Opening it, I was transported back to a time when words flowed freely from my pen, when I dreamed of becoming a writer. The pages were filled with short stories, poems, and snippets of ideas for novels. I had forgotten how much joy writing had brought me. Without really thinking about it, I added the notebooks to my suitcase. Maybe it was time to revisit that old dream. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek through the curtains, I heard movement from the guest room. Daniel was awake. My heart rate picked up again, and I had to remind myself to breathe. I couldn't back out now. I made my way downstairs, suitcase in hand, and found Daniel in the kitchen. He was standing by the coffee maker, staring blankly at the gurgling machine. When he heard me enter, he turned, his eyes immediately falling on the suitcase. "So you're really going," he said, his voice flat. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The air between us was thick with unspoken words and emotions. "Where will you go?" Daniel asked, though we both knew the answer. "Emma's," I replied softly. "I called her last night after you went to bed. She's expecting me." Daniel nodded, his jaw clenching slightly at the mention of my sister's name. "How long will you be gone?" I shook my head. "I don't know, Daniel. I need time to figure things out. To figure myself out." He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. After a moment, he simply nodded and turned back to the coffee maker. I stood there for a moment, feeling awkward in my own kitchen. Should I say goodbye? Should I just leave? The uncertainty of it all was overwhelming. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "I should go. I told Emma I'd be there by lunch." Daniel turned back to me, his face a mask of emotions I couldn't quite read. "Sarah, he started, then paused. "I hope you find what you're looking for." It wasn't an apology, wasn't a declaration of love or a plea for me to stay. But it was something. I nodded, offering him a small smile. "Thank you, Daniel." And with that, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, out of the house that had been my home for so many years. As I put my suitcase in the trunk of my car, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt full of possibilities. The drive to Emma's house took about an hour, giving me plenty of time to think. As I navigated the familiar roads of Springfield, my mind wandered to the conversation I'd had with my sister the night before. Emma had been surprised by my call, but her shock quickly turned to concern when she heard the tremor in my voice. "Sarah, what's wrong?" she had asked, her tone instantly protective. I had tried to explain, my words coming out in a jumbled rush. Emma had listened patiently, making soothing noises when my voice cracked with emotion. When I finally fell silent, she didn't hesitate. "Come stay with us," she said firmly. "For as long as you need." Now, as I pulled into her driveway, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Emma's house was everything mine wasn't: warm, lived in, filled with the happy chaos of family life. As I got out of the car, the front door flew open and Emma came rushing out. "Sarah," she cried, enveloping me in a tight hug. I stiffened for a moment, then melted into her embrace, feeling tears prick at my eyes. "It's okay," Emma murmured, rubbing my back. "You're here now. Everything's going to be okay." I nodded against her shoulder, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. When we finally pulled apart, Emma gave me a watery smile. "Come on," she said, taking my hand. "Let's get you settled." The next few hours passed in a blur. Emma's husband, Tom, helped bring in my suitcase while their kids, Lily and Max, peppered me with questions about my unexpected visit. Emma shooed them away, insisting I needed rest, and showed me to their guest room. "Take all the time you need," she said, squeezing my hand. "We're just glad you're here." Left alone in the quiet room, I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling both exhausted and wired. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Daniel. "Hope you arrived safely," it read. "Take care of yourself." I stared at the message for a long moment before putting the phone away without replying. I knew I'd have to deal with Daniel and our situation eventually, but for now, I needed space. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself drawn to the kitchen where Emma was preparing dinner. She handed me a knife and a pile of vegetables without a word, and we fell into a comfortable rhythm of chopping and stirring. "Do you want to talk about it?" Emma asked gently as she stirred a pot of sauce. I paused, knife hovering over a carrot. "I don't even know where to start," I admitted. Emma nodded, not pushing. "Whenever you're ready," she said. "I'm here." As we continued to cook, I found words starting to spill out. I told her about the disastrous dinner, about my night of reflection, about the conversation with Daniel. Emma listened without judgment, only interrupting to ask clarifying questions. When I finally fell silent, Emma turned to me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Oh, Sarah," she said softly. "I had no idea things were so bad. Why didn't you say something sooner?" I shrugged, feeling a familiar shame creep over me. "I guess I was embarrassed," I said. "You always seemed to have everything so together. And Daniel, he always compared me to you. I felt like such a failure." Emma's face crumpled. "Sarah, no," she said firmly. "You are not a failure. And my life isn't perfect, believe me. I'm so sorry if I ever made you feel that way." We hugged again, and I felt something shift between us. The wall of comparison and competition that Daniel had built started to crumble. That night, after a lively family dinner that left me feeling more alive than I had in years, I retreated to the guest room. As I unpacked my suitcase, my hand brushed against the notebooks I'd brought with me. On an impulse, I pulled one out and opened it. The words on the page transported me back to a time when I believed in myself, when I had dreams and ambitions. I read through story after story, poem after poem, marveling at the creativity and passion I'd once possessed. Before I knew it, I found myself reaching for a pen. The words came hesitantly at first, then faster, pouring out of me like a dam had burst. I wrote about my feelings, my fears, my hopes for the future. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was mine. My voice, my thoughts, my story. As I finally set the pen down, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I didn't have all the answers yet. I didn't know what the future held for me and Daniel, or for my rediscovered passion for writing. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, I knew. There were difficult conversations to be had, decisions to be made. But as I climbed into bed, I felt a glimmer of hope. This visit to the unknown wasn't an end, it was a beginning. And I was finally ready to embrace it. The days at Emma's house blended into weeks, each one bringing a new revelation about myself and my situation. The initial relief of escaping my suffocating life with Daniel gradually gave way to a gnawing uncertainty about my future. What was I going to do? How long could I impose on Emma and her family? These questions haunted me, especially in the quiet hours of the night. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I made a decision. I couldn't keep living in limbo. I needed to take control of my life. The next morning, I confided in Emma over our usual cup of coffee. I think I need to talk to a lawyer," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Emma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Are you sure?" I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "I can't go back to how things were, Emma. I need to know my options." With Emma's support, I started researching divorce lawyers in Springfield. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. But with each step, I felt a little stronger, a little more in control. I finally settled on a lawyer named Mr. Bennett. His website described him as experienced in handling complex divorce cases, with a focus on empowering his clients. When I called to make an appointment, his calm, professional manner put me at ease. The day of the appointment arrived faster than I expected. I stood in front of the mirror in Emma's guest room, smoothing down my blouse and taking deep breaths to calm my nerves. This was it. This was the first step towards a new life. Emma drove me to Mr. Bennet's office, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze before I got out of the car. "You've got this, Sarah," she said with a smile. "I'll be right here when you're done." Mr. Bennet's office was on the third floor of a nondescript building in downtown Springfield. As I sat in the waiting room, my palms sweaty and my heart racing, I couldn't help but think about how different this was from the life I had imagined for myself. I had never thought I'd be sitting in a divorce lawyer's office, contemplating the end of my marriage. "Mrs. Walker?" The receptionist's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Mr. Bennet will see you now." Mr. Bennet was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stood as I entered, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Mrs. Walker, please, have a seat." As I settled into the chair across from his desk, Mr. Bennet's demeanor put me at ease. He listened attentively as I poured out my story, nodding sympathetically and asking clarifying questions when needed. "Mrs. Walker," he said when I had finished, "I want you to know that what you've experienced is a form of emotional abuse. You have every right to seek a better life for yourself." His words hit me like a physical force. Abuse. I had never allowed myself to use that word, always making excuses for Daniel's behavior. Hearing it from a professional made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Mr. Bennet went on to explain my options, discussing the divorce process, division of assets, and potential outcomes. As he spoke, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time, I could see a path forward. "Of course," Mr. Bennet said, leaning back in his chair, "we don't have to file for divorce immediately. Sometimes, the threat of legal action can be a wake-up call. It might be worth having a conversation with your husband first, laying out your concerns and conditions for potentially continuing the marriage." I nodded, considering his words. Part of me still loved Daniel, or at least the man I had thought he was. Maybe, with the reality of divorce looming, he would be willing to change. "What would that look like?" I asked. Mr. Bennet smiled. "Well, we could draft a separation agreement. It would outline your terms, perhaps counseling, both individual and couples, a trial separation period, and specific behavioral changes you need to see. We'd present this to your husband, making it clear that if these conditions aren't met, we're prepared to file for divorce." The idea resonated with me. It felt like a way to take control without immediately burning all my bridges. I think I'd like to try that," I said. Over the next week, Mr. Bennet and I worked together to draft the separation agreement. Each line we wrote felt like another step towards reclaiming my life. When it was finally ready, I knew it was time to face Daniel. I called him on a Tuesday afternoon, my voice steadier than I felt. "Daniel, we need to talk. Can I come by the house tomorrow evening?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Of course, Sarah. I'll be here." The next day, I found myself standing outside the home I had shared with Daniel for so many years, Mr. Bennet by my side. I had insisted on his presence, knowing I would need the support to stand my ground. "Ready?" Mr. Bennet asked, his briefcase in hand. I took a deep breath and nodded. "As I'll ever be." I used my key to let us in, calling out as we entered. "Daniel." "It's me. I've brought someone with me." Daniel appeared from the living room, his eyes widening as he took in Mr. Bennet's professional appearance. "Sarah. What's going on? Who's this?" "Daniel," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "This is Mr. Bennet. He's my attorney." The color drained from Daniel's face. "Attorney? Sarah, what are you doing?" Mr. Bennet stepped forward, his manner calm and professional. "Mr. Walker, I'm here to discuss some important matters regarding your marriage. Shall we sit down?" Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment, he nodded stiffly and led us into the living room. As we sat down, I couldn't help but notice how different everything looked. Had it really only been a few weeks since I'd left? It felt like a lifetime. "Mr. Walker," Mr. Bennet began, "Mrs. Walker has retained my services to discuss the future of your marriage." We have a document here that outlines her concerns and the conditions under which she would consider continuing the relationship. Daniel's eyes darted between Mr. Bennet and me, a mix of confusion and anger on his face. Conditions? Sarah, what is this? I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Daniel, I can't go on the way things were. The constant criticism, the comparisons to Emma, the way you made me feel worthless, it has to stop. This document outlines what needs to change if there's any hope for our marriage. Mr. Bennet opened his briefcase and pulled out the separation agreement. This document details Mrs. Walker's terms. They include attending both individual and couples counseling, a 6-month trial separation period, and specific behavioral changes that Mrs. Walker needs to see. Daniel's face had gone pale. And if I don't agree? Then, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, I'll be filing for divorce. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with finality. Daniel slumped in his chair, the fight seeming to drain out of him. I didn't. I never meant. He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. I know, I said softly. But intention doesn't change the impact, Daniel. I've been unhappy for a long time, and I can't live like that anymore. Mr. Bennet gently placed the document on the coffee table. Mr. Walker, I suggest you take some time to review this agreement. You may want to consult with your own attorney before signing. But I want to make it clear that Mrs. Walker is serious about these terms. Daniel nodded numbly, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. As Mr. Bennet and I stood to leave, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to comfort Daniel, to assure him that everything would be okay. But another part, a stronger part, knew that I needed to stand firm. I'll give you some time to think about it, I said. You can call me when you're ready to talk. As we walked out of the house, I felt lighter than I had in years. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was mine to shape. Mr. Bennet turned to me as we reached his car. You did well in there, Mrs. Walker. Remember, whatever happens next, you're taking control of your life. That's something to be proud of. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. Thank you, Mr. Bennet. For everything. As I watched him drive away, I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. The man with the suit had helped me take a huge step today. Now, it was up to me to keep moving forward, one day at a time. The days following my confrontation with Daniel were a blur of emotions. I fluctuated between feeling empowered and terrified, confident and uncertain. Emma was my rock through it all, always ready with a cup of tea and a listening ear when I needed to talk things through. A week passed before I heard from Daniel. When my phone rang and his name flashed on the screen, my heart leaped into my throat. With trembling hands, I answered the call. Sarah, Daniel's voice was soft, almost unrecognizable. I've read through the agreement. I think we need to talk. Can you meet me? We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop in town, neutral ground for both of us. As I walked into the cafe, I spotted Daniel immediately. He looked different, tired, disheveled, a far cry from his usually impeccable appearance. Hi, I said, sliding into the seat across from him. Daniel looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. Sarah, I'm sorry. I had no idea you were so unhappy. I never meant to make you feel worthless. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Intention doesn't always match impact, Daniel. Whether you meant to or not, that's how you made me feel. He nodded, looking down at his hands. I've been doing a lot of thinking this past week. I realize now how controlling and critical I've been. I want to change, Sarah. I want to be better. Part of me wanted to reach out, to comfort him. But I reminded myself of all the times I'd forgiven him before, all the promises of change that had never materialized. I'm glad you want to change, Daniel, I said carefully. But I need you to understand that it doesn't automatically fix everything. I need time and space to heal, to figure out who I am outside of our relationship. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand. I've signed the separation agreement. And I've made an appointment with a therapist. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was more than I had dared to hope for. Thank you, I said softly. That's a good start. We spent the next hour talking more openly than we had in years. Daniel shared his own insecurities and fears, things he'd never voiced before. I talked about my lost dreams, my desire to write again. By the time we parted, we had a plan in place: 6 months of separation, during which we'd both attend individual therapy and, eventually, couples counseling. As I watched Daniel walk away, I felt a mix of sadness and hope. Our marriage might not survive this, but at least we were both committed to growing and healing. The next few months were a whirlwind of change. With Emma's encouragement, I enrolled in a creative writing class at the local community college. The first day I walked into the classroom, my heart pounding with excitement and nerves, I felt like I was reclaiming a part of myself I'd lost long ago. My classmates were a diverse group, ranging from college students to retirees, all united by our love of words. As we shared our stories and gave each other feedback, I felt my confidence growing. The stories I'd kept bottled up inside for so long began to pour out onto the page. One day, about 3 months into our separation, I received a call from an unknown number. It turned out to be a literary magazine. They wanted to publish one of the short stories I'd submitted on a whim. I called Emma immediately, my voice shaking with excitement. "Em, you won't believe it. Remember that story I wrote about the woman who finds her voice through painting? It's going to be published." Emma's squeal of delight matched my own excitement. "Sarah, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you." That night, as I reread the acceptance email for the 100th time, I realized something. I was happy. Truly, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't been in years. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were days when the weight of my situation with Daniel felt overwhelming. Days when I questioned every decision I'd made. But I had my writing, my newfound friends from my class, and Emma's unwavering support to help me through the rough patches. Daniel and I continued with our therapy sessions, both individually and together. It was hard work, dredging up old hurts and confronting painful truths about ourselves and our relationship. But slowly, gradually, I began to see changes in Daniel. He was learning to express his emotions in healthier ways, to communicate without criticism. 4 months into our separation, Daniel asked if we could have dinner together. We met at a small Italian restaurant we used to frequent in the early days of our relationship. As we settled into our seats, I couldn't help but notice how different things felt. The tension that had become a constant in our interactions was noticeably absent. "You look good, Sarah," Daniel said, a small smile on his face. "Happy?" I nodded, returning his smile. "I am happy. I've been doing a lot of writing. Actually, I'm going to have a story published next month." Daniel's eyes widened. "That's wonderful. I always knew you were talented. I'm sorry I didn't encourage you more before." We talked through dinner, sharing our experiences over the past few months. Daniel told me about his progress in therapy, how he was learning to manage his stress without taking it out on others. I shared more about my writing, my new friends, the parts of myself I was rediscovering. As the evening drew to a close, Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. "Sarah, I know I hurt you deeply, and I'm truly sorry for that. I'm working hard to be a better person, someone worthy of your love and trust. I hope it's not too late for us." I looked at our joined hands, then up at Daniel's face. I could see the sincerity in his eyes, the changes he'd made. But I could also feel the strength I'd found in myself over these months apart. "Daniel," I said gently, "I can see how much you've changed, and I'm proud of you for doing the work. But I've changed too. I've found parts of myself that I thought were lost forever. I'm not sure if I can go back to being your wife right now." Daniel's face fell, but he nodded understanding. "I understand. Can we at least try being friends? I miss having you in my life, Sarah." I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest. "I'd like that, Daniel. Let's start there and see where it leads." As we left the restaurant, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. Whether Daniel and I found our way back to each other or not, I knew I would be okay. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling inspired. I made myself a cup of coffee and settled down at my desk. Well, Emma's dining table that had become my makeshift writing space. As I opened my laptop and began to type, I felt a familiar thrill run through me. The words flowed easily, a story taking shape beneath my fingertips. It was a story about a woman finding her voice, about the courage it takes to start over, about the beauty of second chances. It was my story, in a way, but also something entirely new. As the sun rose higher in the sky, painting Emma's kitchen in warm golden light, I paused and looked out the window. The world seemed full of possibilities. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but I was excited to find out. This was more than just the beginning of a new day. It was the beginning of my freedom, the start of a new chapter in my life. And this time, I was the one holding the pen.